This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. This week on Roots and All, I'm joined by Pete Case from the Freshwater Habitats Trust to dive into the world of garden ponds, why they can be crucial for wildlife, how to create one, and what makes them such a powerful tool for conservation, right in your own back or front garden. Whether you've got a bucket or a full-blown pond, this one's for you.
I'm Pete Case. I'm the Technical Director at the Freshwater Habitats Trust. I make ponds as part of my job, which is an amazing job to have. I should probably start by talking a little bit about Freshwater Habitats Trust and who we are. We were established in the late 1980s, essentially as a response to the fact that there was nobody else really doing watery things. There were no other charities, and nobody was really paying much attention to ponds. And in the intervening years, we've grown and we've expanded quite significantly. And our remit now includes all sorts of things beyond ponds, but there are all these smaller, overlooked habitats, things like fens, flushers, headwater streams, ditches, and of course, still ponds. And we do work on the larger water bodies too, the rivers and the lakes, but we tend to try and think of ourselves as sticking up for the smaller things, the underrepresented, but the super important watery habitats. And I have a great job at the charity, which is to help oversee, with a team of other people, a large habitat creation scheme, which puts new clean water ponds back into the landscape. And they're being designed and created primarily for great crested newts. That's the sort of funding behind them. So they're sort of countryside ponds, but they're great for newts, and they're also great for the whole suite of other freshwater life as well. So it really is a great job to have and a great charity to work for. And hopefully we can translate some of those principles about how we go and create those ponds in the countryside to the garden, and thinking about how that might relate to garden ponds.
This is it. I mean, some people kind of assume that garden ponds are going to be really ornamental, and they can be, but actually a lot of gardeners now are thinking down the wildlife gardening route. So it makes perfect sense for us to take pointers from a pond that's kind of naturally occurring or something that's created as a habitat and applying those principles in our gardens, which is why what you do is so important and so relevant to gardeners who are looking to encourage wildlife. I think a lot of gardeners know there's a lot of gardening books around wildlife, and they tend to say the first thing you should do is put in a pond or put in a water source in the garden. Do you concur?
Absolutely, yeah. Adding water, totally. It's a wonderful thing to do, to add water. But I think my take on this for the garden is that there's kind of no right or wrong water source, and it's not really our place to tell people what sort of pond that they should have in their garden. And I think it all comes down, in the same way that you might design a garden with a vision in mind. It's important to think about what you want that pond to look like. And, you know, at one end of the scale, perhaps there's a very sort of formal ornamental fish pond, perhaps. At the other end of the scale, which is I think what you alluded to, was the idea of a kind of messy tangle of vegetation with logs around it and the sort of nice habitat surrounding it. And it depends what your vision is, really, I suppose, and what you can tolerate. But there are some key kind of underlying principles I think you can apply to all those things, all those types of pond. And we can perhaps dive into a few of those sort of underlying things of how you can make the best possible pond in the garden. And it's the same sort of things that I think would apply to designing ponds in the countryside.
Yeah, absolutely. We can dive into that, and that would be very useful, I think, for people listening. So you've sent me actually a very helpful kind of email roundup of the stuff that you work on. The first thing that you said in your kind of principles of clean water pond creation is the water quality. How can you manage that in a garden setting?
Yeah, so I mean, that is the very first thing that we would look at, is the water source. And to sort of set that context around water quality, it's a shame, but unfortunately, the water environment across the country is generally quite degraded and quite polluted. There are lots of reasons for that we don't need to necessarily go into super detail on, but there are common pollutants, particularly nitrates and phosphates, that have found their way into water bodies of all types, including ponds, sadly. With creating ponds, we get this opportunity to engineer, if you like, clean water back into the landscape. So clean water is like this scarce resource. There's not much of it out there, even though there's lots of watery habitats out there. Most of them, to some degree, suffer from pollution. But by creating ponds, you can think about where you situate that pond in order for it to receive only clean water. And if it receives clean water, it's going to develop into a much, much better habitat for wildlife. That's a fact. It will be better. It will have less problems. It will last longer, and it will be more diverse if it's fed with clean water. So I think the thing that we would start to do is think about that water source. And in the wider landscape, in the countryside, we'd be looking about the catchment. So where is the water draining to that pond from? What is the situation around that pond? Is it intensively managed farmland, which is undoubtedly going to have fertilizer and chemicals added to it? Or is it a nice clean water catchment that's perhaps managed as pasture or hay meadow or heathland? And I think it's that principle of clean water that you can definitely apply to the garden pond as well. So is that water that's draining into that pond going to be clean? The chances are you're going to be relying mainly on rainwater for a garden pond. You're not going to necessarily have a surface water catchment draining into the pond unless you have a huge garden and you've got your pond at the base of the slope. So you're probably going to be relying on rainwater. And there are some tips and tricks, of course, about how you can ensure that there's a resource of rainwater. You could have a water butt, perhaps. You could think about the guttering coming off buildings and routing that into your pond. And basically just trying to ensure that any water that ends up in that pond is as clean as possible. The problem I think we have with garden ponds, and I'm guilty of having done this myself, is that temptation to add tap water. Okay, and we have these little test kits that we use at the Freshwater Habitats Trust, which we use to assess water quality across the landscape. They're little test tubes, and they turn a different colour. They turn pink if there's nitrate detected. If I stick one of these test tubes in my tap water here in Worcestershire, it goes off the scale. It is showing huge amounts of nitrate pollution. And that's fine, that's the way that is. But by adding that water through a hose pipe or whatever to a garden pond, you're going to increase productivity massively. You're going to end up with algae, you're going to end up with duckweeds and things like that dominating. And it's basically going to look like a pea soup. So avoiding adding those chemical pollutants, those nutrients to the pond in the first place is the first place to start on this. So I think clean water is like this key principle. You can apply it to the landscape and you can definitely apply it to a garden pond as well.
So basically, you need to just wait it out and wait for the pond to fill up naturally. Is that the theory behind that?
Yeah, I think so. So I think it's through the guttering from the shed roof or whatever, or from outbuildings or from your roof into a water butt. You can save that water and then use that to top the pond up with. You know, that's going to be as clean as it's going to get, really. I think the other thing is maybe to tolerate to some degree water levels fluctuating. And again, this is one of those things that's sometimes quite tricky for people to understand, is that actually the fluctuation in water levels isn't necessarily a bad thing at all. It's quite okay for ponds to dry down, but it links back to what you want that pond to look like. If you want it to be topped up full of water all the time, then you're going to have to think about a way to fill that pond up. Ideally not using the hose pipe. Alternatively, just allowing that pond to fluctuate and do its own thing over the summer months. And we have had some really seriously dry summers, haven't we? So levels do drop, the water evaporates, and you sometimes do end up with much, much lower levels than perhaps is desirable. But wildlife is pretty resilient. Most of the wildlife in your pond will be tough enough to sort of survive those periods of time where the pond dries down. We know that, most of the water beetles and bugs can fly, and they'll simply just move away to find a new home. The amphibians likely will have moved out of the pond by the time that it's completely desiccated and dried down. And if there's some sediment left at the bottom of the pond, if there's sort of a muddy, silty kind of habitat that's damp still, a lot of stuff will hunker down into that and just wait for the rain to come. But as I say, it links back to what you want that pond to look like. That's not going to fit everybody's idea of what a garden pond should look like. So having that backup, I think, of the clean water on hand probably is the answer.
So I read a book called Ponds, which was put out by the Freshwater Habitats Trust, which is brilliant, and I can't recommend it highly enough. If you're thinking about putting in a wildlife pond, it's really, really excellent.
Is this the new naturalist book then?
Yes, I think so. It's got a white cover, but I'll put a link to it in the show notes so that people can find it. But it's really good. And one of the interesting things it said, so thinking about kind of if you're establishing a pond from scratch, it said, your natural inclination might be to look at a site and say, well, that bit sort of sits where anyway, and then, you know, when it really rains heavy, it will get surface water on it, and then it'll drain away again as it dries out. But actually, the book said that might not be the best place to have a pond, because that's already kind of like its own little habitat and ecosystem, and so you don't really want to destroy that, and there might be a lot more going on than you expect. And actually, the whole kind of ethos behind the book is, I think, tread very carefully, because actually you don't know what you're destroying. You need to think very carefully about what you're doing at all stages.
There is always that temptation, I think, to think, yes, a damp spot, a kind of place that pools with water might be the best place to dig up. But you're absolutely right that often those sort of seasonally damp habitats are super important too. And the best thing might be to just leave that well alone and create your pond in a slightly different place. It's all about maintaining and achieving the most sort of diverse mix of possible habitats across the site. When we assess sites for pond creation in the wider countryside, on farmland, for example, we'll deliberately leave those more interesting wet patches alone, allow those to develop. There might be springs, there might be sort of flushes off hillsides, and they can be super important. You might find a slightly more boring piece of ground to create your pond in. As long as the substrate is right, we don't line our ponds, which is what differs massively, I think, from the garden ponds that we're talking about. We tend to dig our ponds directly into the substrate, either to receive groundwater or surface water if it's a clay landscape. But yeah, leaving those interesting bits alone. And again, I think you'd do the same thing in your garden. You wouldn't want to dig something up that was valuable for wildlife in order just to create something else in its place. And you can apply this to pond restoration as well. Pond restoration is a really, really popular sort of activity to do in the countryside. Restoring ponds is seen as a great thing. And I think we also consider that to be one of the sort of tools in the box, if you like. So there's nothing wrong with restoring ponds. But actually, if you can create new ponds from scratch, then you've got that range of successional habitats. You've got some that are late stage that might be very shaded, and they might be suitable for certain specific insects or creatures. And then you've got the open early stage successional habitats, which are also really important, but for a different range. And it's all about achieving that diversity. Again, I think you can do that in your garden. If you've got the luxury of space, why not have those differing stages of succession? Why not have some boggy damp patches, some very, very shallow ponds, and then some that are slightly deeper that maintain the water for longer? And then you have that range.
Yeah, and also on the subject of managing ponds, I guess you have to really be careful about what you plant around your pond, because I know from experience that wildlife ponds can seem like a constant kind of struggle, and it is probably one of the worst places to work if you're thinking of, you know, trying to weed it or tidy it. For so many reasons. One, it's kind of quite often damp and boggy, and you'll feel like you're damaging the soil structure or stuff underfoot. The other thing is that you're moving amongst creatures that are using that as a habitat. Another thing is it's an absolute nightmare to get plants out of a pond margin if they've got established, and it seems to be the perfect breeding ground for all the plants that you don't particularly want. Have you got any kind of general guidance for people who are thinking of planting around their pond or managing around their pond? My instinct is to actually just give it up as a bad job, because quite often, it's easier to mow a strip round the edge, than try and fight nature and what it wants to do.
Yeah.
But that's not always easy in a garden setting, I know.
It's not. No, let's break that down into a couple of different things. So in terms of management, you have to bear in mind that most pond plants and animals have co-evolved with grazing herbivores, okay? So they're quite tough. The best ponds that we see in the countryside are grazed by livestock. And that's for lots of different reasons. It's to do with the fact that those ponds are kept open by the livestock, by their poaching, where the cows or sheep or whatever are creating depressions in the mud, and they're creating those micro habitats. And that grazing is what keeps ponds in good condition. Obviously, you can't graze your pond in your garden. You're very unlikely to have grazing animals in your garden. So you're going to have to mimic that sort of activity. And I think you can be quite tough, particularly on the plants. You're going to need to think about how that garden pond is going to be managed long term. And it will involve undoubtedly being a bit selective about what gets taken out, what gets weeded out. And in the winter months, and it is a winter activity, I think it's probably best to do this in the winter, is just to be a bit ruthless and take out anything that's a bit too vigorous. If you leave that on a pile by the side of the pond, then any invertebrates and any overwintering amphibians can crawl out of that and back into the pond. But it's important not to let that vegetation rot down, because then you'll be adding nutrients. It'll basically be like liquid fertilizer running back into the pond. So leave it for a bit and then move it out of the way, I think. That management is absolutely critical. And as garden ponds tend to be quite small, as I'm sure you will have seen, they do tend to suffer from that lack of space and things taking over somewhat. There's a bit of a myth around heavily vegetated ponds that they're a bad thing. We actually don't think that at all. And very heavily vegetated ponds can be completely amazing for wildlife because they've got a lot of structure, got a lot of space in amongst those plants that you perhaps don't see from the surface when you're looking down. But actually under the water, there's quite a lot of space still for insects and amphibians and everything else to live in amongst. So it's about maintaining that balance, but I think probably accepting that if you're going to plant up your pond, you're going to need to anticipate there being some degree of management in the future. For the ponds that we create in the wider landscape, the wildlife ponds on farmland, for example, we never plant those ponds. We allow the ponds to colonize completely naturally with plants. And that does happen quite slowly. And this is about, again, resetting those expectations of what you think that pond is going to turn into, because we never quite know. And that's one of the exciting things. We don't know what's going to arrive when, but we know that eventually plants will colonize, wind-blown seeds, or perhaps deer or livestock that are grazing around the edge of the pond will bring seeds and they'll deposit them, or birds. And we'll end up with a flora, which can be completely amazing. It can happen quite quickly in a couple of years, or it can take much longer. But that's natural. It's natural colonization. We're allowing the plants that want to establish there to take root and not introducing things artificially. There is a temptation to want to speed that up and to plant ponds. And I think that's definitely relevant to a discussion around garden ponds, is that you're not really going to be able to wait it out in a garden pond because the chances of things coming naturally, I think, are quite slim. But in the wider landscape, we certainly wouldn't want to plant ponds. We wouldn't want to introduce things. And there's some fairly big risks around introducing plants that have been cultivated specifically through the sort of garden centres and nurseries, in that there is a risk there that they will come with unwanted plants attached to them. And ponds do suffer, sadly, as do all water bodies really in the landscape, suffer from invasive species, non-native species that have found their way into these sensitive habitats. Probably one of the vectors being through gardening and through garden ponds. We've got a lot better at this. There's a huge amount more awareness around the risks of this these days, and there's much better biosecurity. But there is still a risk that if you buy a plant from a garden centre, then it comes attached with either duckweed perhaps, or Crassula helmsii, which is the New Zealand pygmy weed, which we have an ongoing battle with in the countryside. That Crassula is spreading and does sadly invade ponds, and it's fairly impossible to eradicate. You don't want those plants out in the countryside. If they're contained in a garden pond, that's quite bad, but you can do something about that. You can perhaps manage them. Once they're out in the open and in the landscape, then it's impossible to do anything about, really. So it is a bit of an issue.
And aside from the margins of the pond, I think there's quite often a temptation to get in the pond and clean it, like try and get vegetation out that might be growing in towards the middle of the pond, or get out falling leaves, that kind of thing. Is that always necessary?
Well, I think with leaf litter, this is an interesting one with leaf litter, that there's always that perception that leaves falling in the pond are a bad thing. And obviously, you don't want too much of that. You don't want a huge buildup of sludge and leaf litter at the base of the pond, because that's going to reduce oxygen levels and it's going to lead to a pond that isn't very good for wildlife longer term. However, there's a balance to be struck there, because some of that leaf litter is absolutely critical. It's food, it's shelter. Wildlife relies on that to some extent. So I think it's about that balance. And this links into this idea of shading and whether ponds should be shaded or not. And again, there are parallels that you can draw with the wider landscape and indeed gardens about that perception of whether a pond should have shade or not. And it is balance. It's making sure that you have some shade, some dappled shade, which is great. And you accept the fact that due to that dappled shade, you're going to have some leaf litter that falls into that pond over autumn. And it's going to potentially start to slowly infill that pond and may eventually need some management. But I think the benefits of that shade probably outweigh that. And the fact that you've got those micro habitats that are being created in the pond by that subtle shade, and they might be doing very interesting things. They might be suppressing the plants that you don't want, that shade. It might be producing those conditions that some plants don't like. So it's going to create open niches for other things to exist. And if we're really lucky, we find in the countryside still is water violet. So Houtonia palustris, beautiful, beautiful plant. And that actually quite likes the shade. And you sometimes find that in these shady conditions. And it's doing pretty well because nothing else can tolerate this shade. So it's getting its chance to flower or whatever and to grow in these slightly more shady conditions. That shade will also produce slightly different conditions for wildlife to shelter and find refuge in. So places that are slightly cooler, it will reduce evapotranspiration rates as well. So there is massive benefit to shade. The unfortunate thing is, of course, that shade often comes with that leaf litter, and eventually over time, particularly with a small pond, you're going to need to do some management of that pond. And that might be as drastic as desilting, where you do drain that pond down or wait till it dries out and then remove that sludge from the base. And that's not a pleasant job to do. It's one of the reasons that pond restoration, if you're going to do the full works on restoring a pond, it's one of the reasons it's a very expensive thing to do, because that's quite a specialist job. But you can do that in the garden. I'd be super wary about liners though, and that's one of the things maybe to think about, is that in the garden, the chances are that you're going to have a liner. You're not going to necessarily have that pond dug directly into the substrate. Every time you physically get into that pond or you put a rake in or anything, you run the risk of puncturing that liner, which is obviously pretty critical to the pond holding water.
One of the things I think that you mentioned again in your email to me was that you'd put your own garden pond in, and I don't know whether or not that's got a liner, but there were kind of, I think, lessons learnt along the way. So from your experience, what would be your kind of top tips?
So absolutely. So yes, we're on sand here in Worcestershire, in North Worcestershire. So there was absolutely no chance of that pond holding water in the garden. It's a very small pond, just to sort of reset your expectations of what you're thinking about. In my garden, it's a couple of meters wide at best. My lessons learned, I think the liner was an inevitable thing we had to do. We had to put the liner in. I think my biggest regret is not making that pond a little bit bigger and a little bit more varied. I'll caveat this by saying it was actually my daughter that helped me dig that pond as part of a piece of homework for her science at school. We dug that as a habitat which we documented. So it was done in haste, and yeah, it could have perhaps been a little bit more interesting in terms of the profile. Not quite got all the shallows in it that we'd want to see. So yeah, the line is inevitable. I super regret filling it with tap water, but we had to do that to take the photographs of the pond for the piece of homework. And I ended up with a load of pea soup green sludge in the pond, which wasn't very nice after a few weeks. So yeah, there's that. In terms of plants and things, so I'm probably in a bit of a fortunate position that I've managed to collect seed. So I think this is probably the way to do this with plants, either by going to an accredited supplier who can guarantee the native sort of provenance of those plants and guarantee that they're going to be free of invasive species. I grew things on from seed in pots in sort of trays that had water sitting in the base, and I've introduced those plants into the pond. It is a tangled mess. It is very, very heavily vegetated, but it's full of life. It's full of invertebrates. And we've got frogs and one smooth newt having arrived. So, yeah, I don't have regrets necessarily, but I think probably making it a bit more complex and a bit more interesting, and probably accepting that I might want to take up a little bit more space in the garden. In the future, perhaps we'll redo that. I was surprised at how expensive the liner was, though. So that's one of the reasons that we kept it quite small. It did start to get quite expensive the bigger you went.
Right. Well, that's definitely going to be a defining factor, I'm sure, for some people with the pond. I'm very lucky I'm on clay, so we just kind of trod ours down and then just left it. So that's a big bonus for us. So yeah, just to say, obviously, I'm going to put the link to the book to your website in the show notes. Is there any other resources that you could point out that might be useful to people in a garden setting?
Yeah. So if you search out Garden Pond Advice Hub on the Freshwater Habitats Trust website, there's all sorts of brilliant advice there about garden ponds. We've also got a joint leaflet that Freshwater Habitats Trust and Amphibian and Reptile Conservation Trust put together, which is a lovely booklet with photographs and guidance about how to make the best ponds for wildlife in your garden. If you want to survey your pond, then every year Freshwater Habitats Trust runs a spawn survey, so you can log your records of frog spawn and toad spawn if you're really lucky to have toads breeding in your garden. And in the wider landscape as well, you can submit those records. And if you're a landowner who's got more land than just your garden, then there's a whole load of fact sheets and information on our website about creating ponds from scratch. This was guidance that was put together for something called the Million Ponds project that we ran a few years ago, but those fact sheets still sit on the website, and they are the best practice guidelines for creating the best possible wildlife ponds. And there's also some information, a joint piece that we did with the University College of London on restoring ponds and how to restore ponds for wildlife as well. So there's a huge amount of information out there. There's the pond book, which I think is the book that you're talking about, the A4 book with the white cover. So that's a brilliant resource. And there's the New Naturalist publication that Professor Jeremy Biggs and Dr. Penny Williams have written, which has also been published as well recently. So there's loads of information out there, and I wish your listeners luck in creating their garden ponds, because it's a brilliant thing to have. It's endlessly fascinating. Children absolutely love it. And I spend many happy hours just peering in, looking at what's arrived.
Thank you very much to Pete and the Freshwater Habitats Trust for their sterling work, and thanks to you for listening. I also wanted to give a shout out to Anna and her daughter, who've been on nighttime toad patrols and have sent me a lovely video of them diligently moving toads out of the road to safety, which they were inspired to do after listening to the Froglife episode. People making a difference right there. Thanks to them and to you for making a difference, one kind action at a time. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.